Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. I'm going to be covering this book, The Tales of Catt and Fisher. This series is one I hadn't heard of before, and is kind of intriguing to me, though it's intriguing conceptually. I don't think it's as interesting in practice. And what I'm talking about is that this is a book 3 of a series called After the War. The first one was Redemption's Blade, written by Adrian Tchaikovsky. The second, Salvation's Fire, by Justina Robson. This one was also edited by Justina Robson, and the subtitle is The Art of the Steel. Now, what spoke to me when I saw this was that cover, Two Adventurers. I'm a fan of earthy colors, of natural colors, of greens, of browns. The vegetation, the giant ruin in the background spoke to me. I really love that kind of aesthetic. And we can thank Tomas Jedrzejczyk for the cover art. This is printed in Denmark, which I think is the first book I know of. The first book I know of in my library that was printed in Denmark, which is kind of cool. I never thought of that as a place that I would be getting books from. So, what this book does is it is a collection of multiple stories written by multiple authors, but about the same two characters. And some of them were more fun than others. I think some of these authors were better at capturing the idea of these characters than others. And that's kind of disappointing. But the introduction says this book contains some stories about Dr. Catt and Fisher. They first appeared in Adrian Tchaikovsky's novel Redemption's Blade, which is the first book in the multi-author series. As characters, they were so delightful that when it came time to write my continuation of that story world, Salvation's Fire, I wrote about them too. When the project concluded, the editors at Rebellion, Adrian and I, decided they were too good to keep just to ourselves and that they ought to be shared. This book, dear reader, is the result of sharing out the very entertaining characters. For some reason, very entertaining and characters are all capitalized, VEC. It comprises 4 novellas written by outstanding voices in the field of fantasy, and I will not make a pun about them standing out in a field, although the lingering traces of Doctors Catt and Fisher really want me to. This book is in full 430 pages, but not all of these novellas are the same length. The first one is about 110 pages, so about a quarter of this. The second one is about 130 pages. The following is about 80 pages. And the last is only about 90 pages. So, what are these stories then? Well, Doctors Catt and Fisher are both archaeologists, or not necessarily archaeologists, but magic item hounds. They're archaeologists in the vein of Indiana Jones, but instead of in a modern world or a real world setting like Indiana Jones, they are set in a magical world, a fantasy world with gods and demigods, necromancers and usurpers, kings, queens, magicians, magic items, artifacts, that kind of thing. And Doctors Catt and Fisher operate a store through which they sell magical items and artifacts, and are often retrieving those artifacts themselves, though sometimes they also purchase them at auction. So with that in mind, what we have is, like, this first story is about an attempt to take an item from a would-be king, and the doctors, Catt and Fisher, being imprisoned or accidentally interacting with rebels and then being framed as rebel agents themselves, foreign agents that have come to this land to disrupt things. And they are accompanied by the person that commissioned them to retrieve certain artifacts. And those artifacts are magic belts that allow the user to turn into griffins. And specifically, these belts are wielded and passed down through lineage by griffin knights. And they turn into griffins, but the griffins are not necessarily all the same looking. They have the same body type, they have the same frame, but certain aspects of them make it look like they're not necessarily the same species. And as it turns out, and this is a mild spoiler, but that comes with these kinds of rants, the belt isn't a belt that allows you to turn into a griffin. It allows you to turn into a specific form, and the knighthood passes down that specific form through fear. Because what better way to imprint upon someone's mind the image of a monster than if it is attacking them? So the senior would turn into a griffin, frighten, and as if they were going to kill the victim or the next in line, and that next in line feels the smell, the face, they every time they transform, they are envisioning that griffin that attacked them. So in theory, each member of that lineage, going however far back, should be turning into the same griffin if it is just a magical spell to turn them into a griffin. But the depictions are changing because each person remembers things through fear slightly differently. And then, as it turns out, it's not even that the belts allow you to turn into griffins, but that it allows you to turn into a specific form that you kind of calibrate when you first use the belts. And how that plays into the overall story was intriguing. It felt like I could predict that, oh, griffins are extinct, or oh, if they're not extinct, they're incredibly rare, critically endangered. I could predict that these griffin knights, their belts were going to be stolen somehow, and I could predict that they were being used so that someone could be able to disguise themselves, but the actual manner of that wasn't quite clear until the very end. And I really liked that story. That was the first one. And there was another one that involved a young man on a mostly independent island. A empire is shipping magic items and artifacts near the island, and there's a shipwreck, and the survivors the survivors of that wreck claim that the lighthouse on the island wasn't working, so the Empire comes in and says, well, we're taking over this and making a new lighthouse. The person in charge of those Imperials is very anti-magic, and his daughter is overseeing the project, but he is in charge of their presence on the island. And he is making an entirely new lighthouse, one that will be managed by the Empire, not by the locals. And this upsets one of the locals, whose job it has been his whole life to be the keeper of the lighthouse. And so he is blamed when things start going wrong, but as it turns out, he's been hiding in his lighthouse the entire time. And when they go in, they find that his house is full of all the artifacts that were supposed to have been on the ship, that were believed to have been lost in the shipwreck, but this lighthouse keeper has been diving for oysters and whatnot for so long that he is able to hold his breath long enough to get those artifacts. But they corrupt him because they're not the sort of magical item that needs to be they are the sort of magical item that needs to be curated and maintained by people powerful enough to watch them and guard against them. But one of the local boys is a kind of courier slash assistant to the overseer, the daughter of the commander that is in charge of that garrison there. She herself has some engineering knowledge, and that's why she is the overseer of this project. She asks her courier to get some, like, a list of things for her, and one of the items is a scale from this legendary moth. And he doesn't recognize it, but apparently in engineering circles this is kind of like a joke item, but the overseer had studied under either Dr. Catt or Fisher, I forget which, and she recognized the name of the moth. She knew that it was probably a joke by someone in the masonry field, but she recognized the name of that moth from one of the doctor's books, and so reaches out to them, and they go out there, investigate it, and find out, yes, this is actually the moth where that this legendary moth. We are going to try and get some scales from it, and what it turns out to be is this titanic moth that is kind of like, its scales are a ward against a certain kind of magic, but the doctors, the overseer, and this courier go out to get these scales from this moth. As I said, titanic, multiple hundreds of feet big, just the body. The wings so much bigger that they are climbing on the legs. They are doing battle on the back, on the wings. And the courier, who for some reason is along, ends up hearing kind of a voice in his head and sees that the moth is tethered, is shackled to the ground there. And as it turns out, when he frees it, the moth flies away. There is now an actual otherworldly problem to deal with, and the things that appeared to be demons were actually kind of locals. They were non-human creatures that neither Doctors Catt or Fisher had ever encountered before, but who were there to guard this imprisoned moth to prevent people from interfering with what they were doing, which was effectively using the moth as a shield against otherworldly invasion. And so it leaves with that untied plot thread of, oh, this moth needs to be handled eventually, but the scale, a single scale from this moth, is so big that it covers the entirety of the top of the lighthouse, and thus it does its magical power. But the characters interact in really interesting ways with that. Overall, the stories were interesting, and I liked the idea of handing over a beloved character. I mean, Tchaikovsky handed it over to Robson, but then Robson edited this one, but didn't write in this. So Tchaikovsky wrote one story, and then 3 other authors wrote the following stories. So in this case, Tchaikovsky was once again handing over his characters to other people, and it's this evolving timeline with these characters that just fascinates me, and I'd never read a book like that. And it's also kind of cool, like, it's printed in Denmark, and I'd never heard of the publisher before, but it's just an interesting premise for a collection of stories, a collection of novellas. So I liked this book, and I am looking forward to reading Robson's book, the second in the series, and Tchaikovsky's book, the first in the series, and how those 2 authors write these 2 characters in their own full-length stories. So Yeah, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.